Well, first of all, of greatest concern to mankind as a whole is this dilemma of peace or war, because we now have a major war unfolding in Europe, and not every country is working together to try to put an end to this war, and some countries are still pouring fire onto the war. And I think we need to solve this war and whatever that's related to it through peaceful means, through diplomacy, so that this will be brought to an end immediately. Now, together with this war, you really have a multitude of all other crises, including energy crisis, financial crisis, uh, exchange rates crisis, for example, currency crisis, and and all this add up together to create a very dangerous situation because we are now talking about the world economy may be sliding into major recession starting from next year, and financial crisis may explode in quite a few other countries. So I think this is the world we are living through, and at the same time, technological changes are really accelerating. So I think at the G20 meeting or the APEC summit or the ASEAN summit, for example, or the world leaders really need to put their acts together to figure out a way to stimulate growth and to remove all the obstacles to growth and try to make sure that peace and stability are defended rather than, for example, to indulge in fantasies of another Cold War, try to cut off several countries from the rest of the world. I think we need to do the constructive thing rather than allow these countries to do the destructive things.
Now, talking about world economy, Professor, let's remember G20 is the gathering of the world's largest economy. You talk about options for being constructive or destructive. What are some of the constructive options or outcomes are you looking for?
Indeed, G20 is one of the most effective and meaningful frameworks to talk about global economic and financial and trade cooperation. I would say G20 should stand firm, focusing on its original mandate, rather than being distracted to talk about other things not directly related to global economic and financial and trading issues. And in this regard, I think one thing of crucial importance is that we still need to talk about the connectivity in the different economies, the globalization, for example, even though it is suffering major setbacks, and there are several countries which are promoting what we call reverse globalization or anti-globalization, and we cannot allow protectionism to really raise its very dangerous head. So I think talking about connectivity, talking about sustainability of the development, and then the joint efforts to promote common prosperity, rather than, for example, several countries need to develop at the expense of other countries. And I think in this way, the G20 and all its member states will have a role to play to pitching all their efforts together in the same direction, rather than, for example, going separate ways. And in some cases, as revealed by several countries in recent months or recent years, they try to destabilize the global situation rather than stabilize the global situation.
Now, Professor, let's look at the larger picture. China has been calling for a fair and just global governance system. Now, tell us more about the essence of China's proposal and how does this differ from the so-called rule-based international system proposed by some of the Western countries?
First of all, when we hear the so-called rule-based international order, we need to ask a question: whose rule? Who made the rules? And who are supposed to abide by the rules? I think in the world of today, what really matters the most is the United Nations, the UN Charter, for example, the UN organizations, and all countries really need to rally behind the United Nations. And if something, for example, does not have the blessing of the United Nations, then we cannot do it, because otherwise it may not be in the interest of the global community. So when several countries in the world today keep talking about rule-based international order, we need to confront them. We need to really ask them, what are the rules? Who made these rules? With the consent of whom? And how these rules will be enforced? Because otherwise, some country may pretend to hold out its own rule as if it has universal application, as if, for example, all the others need to be dictated by these rules. And from the Chinese perspective, we are very much promoting multilateralism because in the world of today, countries big or small need to be treated equal. No one should be allowed to put itself above all the other countries or me first, for example. No, if talking about being first, every country in the world, about 200 of them, deserve a right to be the first, or at least they should give a try to do their best to promote themselves. But promoting each other's interest should not be done at the expense of other countries' legitimate interest. Therefore, we are talking about interconnected world, a dynamic world, and everyone will do its bit, but no one should be allowed to do its bit to promote itself at the expense of the world at large or at the expense of other countries. I think this will be a better version for the world because every country has the right to develop its own way, and the political system for that country may be tailor-made to solve or adapt to the circumstances in that country. And no country has a monopoly of truth. No country has a monopoly of democracy, for example. And no country in the world should be allowed to say, my version is the real, true version of democracy, and all the other systems are not democratic.
Right, Professor, let's talk about some destabilizing factors in the international order nowadays. How about we turn to some recent remarks from senior U.S. officials? White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. would brief the Taiwan region on the result of the upcoming meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden on sidelines of the upcoming G20 summit. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry has something to say about that. Let's take a listen first.
There is only one China in the world. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory. The root cause of the tensions in the Taiwan Strait is that the Taiwan authorities have been soliciting U.S. support to seek Taiwan independence, and that some people in the U.S. intend to use the Taiwan issue to contain China. Moves like this are undermining the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. The official interaction between the U.S. and Taiwan goes against the U.S. commitment of maintaining only unofficial ties with the Taiwan region. What the U.S. said about briefing Taiwan on the meeting between the Chinese and the U.S. heads of state gravely violates the One China principle and the stipulation of the 3 China-U.S. joint communiques.
So, Professor, provoking the other side's bottom line and core interest right ahead an in-person meeting between heads of state. Do you think this is a usual way to deal with bilateral ties?
I think this is a clear sign that someone in Washington is losing his sanity and the system is really degenerating into completely disregarding the legitimate interest, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of China as a whole country. And what they are doing is really tantamount to playing with fire. And the situation involving the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait can be traced back all the way to 1949, when the Civil War actually was not officially brought to an end. Therefore, people throughout the world, especially people on the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait, should really treasure the peaceful and stable situation that we still have since the beginning of the 1980s, rather than, for example, allowing this particular big country to do whatever it is doing right now, which may destabilize the relations between the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait, or may even lead to the resurrection of the unfinished Civil War. And this is exactly what the ASEAN region, the APEC region, for example, and East Asia as a whole do not want to see. We want to maintain stability, we want to defend peace, we want to make sure that the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait can get along with each other. under the framework of one China, and Taiwan is part of China. After all, this is the universal truth every country in the world and all the international organizations recognize. Why should the United States, while still claiming that they stick to the one China policy, they still recognize that Taiwan is part of China, keep hollowing out the one China policy, and keep treating Taiwan as if it were a separate, independent, sovereign country? This is in gross violation of China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I want to tell President Biden, don't play with fire. Wake up and focus on the more constructive things between China and the United States and make some common efforts to make the world we are living in a better world rather than a more dangerous world.